All right, the next component we're going to implement is what I call a block. So on this page, we have multiple blocks or multiple sections. Some of these blocks have a dark background. The others have no background. Also, some of these blocks are skewed to the left or to the right. So let's go ahead and implement this component in isolation. So back in index.html, semantically, we can represent a block using the section element. So we're going to add a section with the class of block. In this section, we're going to add an h2 and a paragraph with some words. Okay. Now in our style sheet, we're going to define a new section called blocks and then add a rule for our blocks, block. Now I'm going to give these blocks a vertical padding of 6 rems and a horizontal padding of 2 rems. Also, to see things more clearly, temporarily, I'm going to give them a border of 2 pixels, solid red. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, here's what we get. If you pay close attention, you can see that the space on the top is greater than the space on the bottom. This comes from the top margin of the heading. Let's verify it real quick. So I'm going to inspect this element. So here's the heading element. Now on the computer tab, on the top, look at the top margin, 33 pixels. So now I'm going to give this element an extra class like block heading and remove the top margin there. So back to our markup, we're going to give this heading a class of block double underscores heading. And then in our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule for block headings and remove the top margin. So margin top is 0. Now back to the browser, the space is equal, great. So what should we do next? Well, we need a variation of this block called block dark. So back to our markup, I'm going to grab this entire section, duplicate it, and then give the second section an extra class, block double hyphens dark. Okay. Now let's define this rule. So block dark is going to have a background of pure black and the text color of 7B858B. Okay, let's verify everything works. Great. Now the heading in the dark block is not white, so we have to define an extra rule and say in block dark elements, if we have a heading, that heading should be white. Take a look. Okay, great. Now, as I showed you earlier, some of these blocks are skewed to the right or to the left. There are a few solutions for implementing this. The one that I prefer is clip path. So earlier in the second part of the series, we talked about clipping images. I showed you that we can grab an image and clip parts of it. So there we talked about clip path generator. We looked at this tool, Clippy. So over here, we can create a custom polygon. So we can add a point here, another point here, one here, and then one more here. So this is how we can create a skewed block. Now look at the generated polygon down the bottom. I'm going to copy this. Now we need to define a new rule called block skewed right and paste that property. Now we need to revise some of these values because our clicks were not quite accurate. So what do these numbers represent? Well, each two combination represents a point. The first number is the X offset, the second is the Y offset. So we want to start from the top left corner of our block. That is 0% and 0%. Then we want to go to the top right corner. So for the X offset, we're using 100%, and for the Y offset, we're using 0%. Great. Then we want to go to the bottom right corner of our block. So 100% and 100%. Great. And finally, we want to go to this particular point. So for the X offset, we're using 0%, and for the Y offset, we're using 86%. Now I want to change this to 80%. That is simpler to work with. Let's see what we get up to this point. So I'm going to make this dark block skewed. We apply a second class, block skewed right. Take a look. All right, here's what we get. Now look at the space below the paragraph. Because we have clipped this block, we have lost some of the padding here. So the padding below the paragraph is less than the padding above the heading. To fix this problem, we should apply an extra padding to skewed blocks. So back to our style sheet. Earlier we used a vertical padding of 6 rems for our blocks. For a block that is skewed, we want to apply a bottom padding of, let's say, 10 rems. Let's see if this solves the problem or not. So here's what we get. I think that looks pretty good. But there is a problem with this implementation. What if tomorrow we come here and decide to change the vertical padding for all blocks to 10 rems? Then we'll have to remember to update the bottom padding for skewed blocks. We don't want to do that. So let's change this to 6 rems. Let me show you a cool trick. Earlier we talked about variables, but up to this point, we have defined all of our variables in the root space, which is globally available to all elements. But we can also define a variable in this particular element or in this particular rule. So if we define a variable or a custom property here, let's call that padding vertical and set it to 6 rems. Now, this custom property is available to an element with the class of block and all of its children. So over here, we can replace 6 rems with padding vertical as a variable. And also in a block that is skewed, we can replace this hard-coded value with padding vertical, all right? Now, we can use the calculate function to grab this value and then add something to it. So we can say, whatever that padding vertical is, add 4 rems to it. With this, we don't have to remember to update the bottom padding for skewed blocks, okay? So we still get the same result as before, and our code is more maintainable. Great. Now, what about a block that is skewed to the left? Well, let's grab this rule, duplicate it, and then change this to skewed left. Now, we're going to change our polygon. So we're going to start from top left, then we go to top right. Then instead of going to the bottom right, we're going to go a little bit up. Let's say for the Y offset, we're going to use 80%. And then for our last point, we're going to go to the bottom left corner of this block. So 0 and 100%. Now back to our markup. Let's change this to block skewed left and see if everything works. Great. Now back to our design mockup. In both the standard and the mobile version, the heading and the paragraph below are center aligned. So back to the rule for our block elements. Here we can set text align to center. And we get center aligned heading and text. But there's a problem with this approach. With this approach, every component that we insert into this block will be center aligned. So back to index.html. Here's our first block. After this paragraph, I want to add a card. So let's pull up our card component and grab all this code, copy it, and then paste it here. Let's see what we get. Look at this card. Even the text in this card is text aligned. So then we'll have to go to every component and apply text align to left. This doesn't make sense. We don't want to remember to reset the text align property for every component we have created or every component we're going to create in the future. So this is not a maintainable solution. Here's a better way to solve this problem. We can assume that what we have on this part is the header of a block. So we can wrap these two elements inside a header and then apply the text align property to the header. So back to our markup, here's our heading and the paragraph. I'm going to wrap these two elements, wrap, inside a header and give it the class of block _header. Okay, so we have a header and inside the header we have an h2 and a paragraph. Now we're going to set text align on block header. So let's copy this. Now back to our style sheet. We don't want to apply text align here. We want to apply it in the header. So real quick, text align is center. Now take a look. So we have center aligned heading and paragraph, but our card is not affected. Great. Now one last thing. With our current implementation, if we resize the browser and make it really wide, our block also gets wider. But if you look at our design mockup for standard or wide screens, you can see that our content is contained inside a grid that is 1100 pixels wide. So I'm going to bring up the guides by pressing Command and H on Mac or Control and H on Windows. We have these blue guides. Now let's grab our ruler and measure the distance from the first to the last line. So take a look. All right, that is 1140 pixels. So even if you have a really wide screen, our content is not going to stretch. It's always going to be inside this boundary. This makes it easier to read our text. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule called container. And here we're going to apply a max width of 1140 pixels. This is a reusable class. It's got nothing to do with blocks. We can use it anywhere. Anywhere we want to apply this constraint. So now back to index.html. Our first block is a white block. We can apply the container class right here to make sure the content doesn't get wider than 1140 pixels. But we cannot apply this class to a dark block. Let me show you why. So here we have a dark block. Let's apply the container class and see what happens. All right, take a look. We have constrained the width of this entire block. That is why we have this extra space. But on a really wide screen, we don't want to constrain the actual block. We want the block to stretch and take up all the available space, but we want to constrain the content of the block. So back to our markup. For dark blocks, we're not going to apply the container class here. Instead, we're going to wrap this content inside a div with the class of container. So wrap with a div with the class of container. All right, now take a look. All right, look, the problem is solved. Now our block is taking up all the available space, but its content is constrained. Great. Now there's one problem here. Look at this white block. Do you see the boundary? So because we applied a max width of 1140 pixels, this block is aligned to the left side of the screen. This is not what we want. We want this block to be right in the center. So as the screen gets wider, we'll have extra space on the sides of the block. How can we solve this? Back to the rule for our containers. Here we're going to set the margin to 0 and auto. And that means 0 pixels for vertical margin and auto for horizontal margin. So if you have extra space, the space will be equally distributed to the sides of this block. And now our block is centered on the page. Great. We're done with the implementation of blocks. So now it's time to remove this ugly border. Great.